You stand at the edge of a forest that shouldn't exist, watching mist curl around trees that were ancient when Merlin was young, and somewhere in the silver-gray depths ahead, something with wings made of starlight blinks out of existence for the very last time. The history of magical creatures is not simply a chronicle of fantastic beasts and where to find them, but rather a heartbreaking ledger of extinction, near misses, and desperate conservation efforts that make modern wildlife protection look positively simple by comparison. You've probably never considered that the wizarding world faces the same ecological catastrophes as the Muggle one, except their endangered species can turn you to stone with a glance or accidentally set your house on fire while sneezing. The Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures, established in 1707, has the unenviable task of protecting beings that often don't want protection, cataloging animals that can disappear at will, and convincing wizards that perhaps breeding dragons in residential neighborhoods isn't the best idea. Throughout the centuries, magical naturalists have documented the slow fade of wonder from the world, species by species, as human expansion, wizard carelessness, and simple bad luck conspired to erase creatures that once filled the skies and forests with impossible beauty. The Victorian era, which saw the real-world extinction of dozens of species, including the quagga in 1883, also witnessed the near-total disappearance of several magical populations, though the Ministry of Magic worked overtime to keep these losses secret from both wizards and muggles. You might wonder how something as powerful as a dragon could ever be considered vulnerable, but power and survival are different things entirely. And even the mightiest creature needs habitat, food, and the basic courtesy of not being hunted for potion ingredients. The concept of magical creature conservation began not with any noble impulse, but with commercial panic, when apothecaries realized their supply of unicorn hair was dwindling, proving that capitalism sometimes accidentally does good things for entirely selfish reasons. Scholars continue to debate whether certain species, like the lethafold, ever truly existed or were simply magical explanations for unexplained deaths, a discussion that becomes particularly awkward when someone actually encounters one. The forest you're walking through now existed long before the Statute of Secrecy in 1692 forced magical beings into hiding, back when dragons nested openly in mountain ranges and phoenixes were spotted with such regularity that medieval artists could paint them with reasonable accuracy. Those medieval illuminated manuscripts that show peculiar beasts weren't all imagination, though try explaining to a Muggle historian that the decorative serpent in that 11th century text was actually a rune spore, and watch their face do interesting things. You take another step into the mist, and the trees seem to lean closer, their branches forming a canopy that blocks out the modern world entirely. The air here tastes different, older, carrying sense of creatures that left no fossils because magical biology doesn't work that way, doesn't leave convenient evidence for future archaeologists to puzzle over. In your hand, you hold a leather journal filled with sketches and notes from Newt Scamander's predecessors, wizards who dedicated their lives to understanding beings that could think circles around them. And you realize that every blank page represents a species they never got to document. The tragedy of magical extinction isn't just biological, but cultural, because when a phoenix dies its final death without rebirth, the world loses not just a bird, but centuries of accumulated wisdom that the creature carried in its ancient eyes. Some magical creatures possess intelligence rivaling wizards themselves, making their disappearance not simple extinction, but something closer to genocide, though the Ministry's official terminology carefully avoids such uncomfortable words. You've read reports of the last known Fwooper singing itself into silence in a remote Scottish valley, its rainbow plumage dulling as it realized no answering call would ever come, and even the dry, bureaucratic language of the report couldn't quite hide the observer's heartbreak. The thing about magical creatures is that they're not simply animals, but living embodiments of natural magic. walking concentrations of power that predate wizard kind, and when they vanish, they take irreplaceable pieces of magical knowledge with them. Imagine being the last of your kind, whether you're a melancholy demiguise or a playful niffler, watching the world change around you without anyone who truly understands what you are. The International Confederation of Wizards established protected reserves in 1750, but by then, several species had already slipped beyond recovery, their last members dying alone in forests that once rang with their calls. You pause beneath a particularly ancient oak, noticing claw marks too large to be from any modern creature, and the forest holds its breath around you. You watch a golden blur streak across the sky above a medieval Quidditch pitch, and you realize you're witnessing something that will be gone within a century, the wild golden snidget making its final desperate flights before wizard sport drives it to the brink of complete annihilation. The story of the golden snidget is perhaps the most shameful chapter in magical creature conservation, a tale of how a species nearly vanished because wizards thought it would be entertaining to chase tiny birds on broomsticks, which in retrospect seems less like sport and more like organized cruelty with better public relations. The snidget, barely larger than a walnut with impossibly beautiful golden feathers that shimmered like captured sunlight, could fly at speeds and execute maneuvers that made it the perfect target for competitive hunting, which is rather like saying something is perfect for extinction. Historical records from the 14th century show that wealthy wizards would release hundreds of snidgets during festivals, awarding prizes to whoever caught the most. And if you're thinking this sounds horrific, congratulations on having more empathy than medieval magical society. The birds' rotational wings allowed them to change direction with impossible speed, darting through the air in patterns that seemed to defy physics, even by magical standards. And watching them fly was reportedly like observing liquid gold poured across the sky. Madame Modesty Rabnot, a witch from Kent, became the unlikely hero of snidget conservation in 1269 when she stormed onto a Quidditch pitch mid-game, used a summoning charm to capture all the released snidgets, and then hexed anyone who tried to stop her, proving that sometimes conservation requires both courage and a willingness to commit minor assault. Scholars debate whether Rabnot's actions actually saved the species or simply delayed the inevitable, but her intervention at least bought time for breeding programs to establish themselves before wild populations collapsed entirely. The real-world passenger pigeon, which went extinct in 1914, despite once numbering in the billions, offers a sobering parallel to what nearly happened to the snidget, demonstrating that abundance is no protection against human thoughtlessness. You float above the pitch. Now, watching as the chief of the Wizards' Council, Barbarous Braga, releases a snidget and offers 150 galleons to whoever catches it, apparently unaware that he's basically announcing an extinction speed run. The tiny bird spirals upward in panic, its wings beating so fast they're invisible, creating a high-pitched hum that sounds like crystal bells being shattered in slow motion. 15 wizards on broomsticks immediately give chase, and you watch this historical atrocity unfold with the uncomfortable knowledge that your favorite sport was built on the suffering of an innocent species, which rather puts a damper on the romantic vision of Quidditch's early days. The pitch is packed with spectators who cheer each near capture, treating the snidget's desperate flight as entertainment. And you're reminded that historical perspective often reveals our ancestors as casually cruel in ways they didn't even recognize. One particularly skilled flyer nearly catches the bird between the pitch's wooden goalposts, but the snidget executes an impossible right-angle turn that would probably liquefy its organs if it weren't magical, darting through the gap between two colliding brooms. The crowd roars and you feel slightly sick, understanding now why the golden snidget became the symbol of everything wrong with early magical sports regulations. When someone finally does catch the bird, crushing it accidentally in their enthusiasm, The crowd's cheer turns to disappointed groans, not because a life was lost, but because the entertainment ended too quickly, which tells you everything you need to know about medieval priorities. Madame Rabnot isn't here yet to save this particular snidget, won't arrive for another hour when her friend mentions the game, and you watch helplessly as history takes its cruel course. The development of the golden snitch as a replacement, a magical ball enchanted to mimic the snidget's flight without requiring actual bird murder, wouldn't occur until Bowman Wright invented it in 1750. Nearly 5 centuries after people first realized maybe killing endangered birds for fun was questionable. You descend from the sky as the game continues, now focused on a leather ball that lacks any of the tragedy you've just witnessed, and you wonder how many games were played before someone finally said perhaps they should stop. The establishment of snidget sanctuaries prevented total extinction, but wild populations never fully recovered, leaving the species forever dependent on wizard protection, a sort of ecological hostage situation where their survival relies on the goodwill of the very beings who nearly destroyed them. Breeding programs in the 18th century managed to stabilize numbers using carefully controlled environments that mimicked the birds' natural habitats, but could never truly replace the freedom of genuine wilderness. You visit one such sanctuary now, watching protected snidgets dart between enchanted trees while wizard naturalists take careful notes, and the birds seem healthy enough, but there's something performative about their flight, as though they're acting out instincts in a space too small to contain their true nature. You stand in a medieval European village square where a dragon has just been sighted circling the mountain peaks above, and you're fascinated to observe that the Muggle peasants respond with terror while the local wizards react with mild annoyance, as though a dragon is less a mythical monster and more an unusually large pest control problem. The relationship between dragons and human civilization tells 2 completely different stories, depending on whether you're magical or not, a divergence that makes the historical record delightfully confusing for anyone trying to piece together accurate dragon lore. To Muggles throughout history, dragons were ultimate evil, divine punishment, or symbolic representations of chaos that needed to be slain by virtuous knights, which shows remarkable imagination considering most Muggle dragon encounters ended with the Muggle running away while a memory charm team cleaned up the incident. Medieval bestiaries described dragons with such wild inaccuracy that modern scholars wonder if the authors ever actually saw one or just compiled rumors from traumatized villagers whose memories had already been modified, creating a sort of historical game of telephone played across centuries. The real-world Komodo dragon, discovered by Western science only in 1910, demonstrates how even non-magical large reptiles can hide in plain sight for millennia, suggesting that wizards' ability to keep actual dragons secret isn't as implausible as skeptics claim. You watch as a Romanian longhorn descends toward a flock of sheep, its scales gleaming like polished bronze, and the village's designated dragon handler sighs the sigh of someone whose entire job is preventing international incidents. Dragons possess intelligence that most wizards historically underestimated, treating them as dangerous animals rather than beings capable of complex thought, though recent dragonologist studies suggest they may have sophisticated social structures that wizard observers simply failed to recognize because they were too busy not being eaten. The debate over dragon sentience continues to rage in academic circles, with some researchers arguing that dragons deserve being status rather than beast classification, while others point out that beings generally don't try to eat everyone they meet, which seems like a fair point, honestly. Chinese fireball dragons in the Far East received very different treatment than their European cousins, revered in Muggle mythology, while simultaneously being secretly managed by Chinese wizards who developed dragon handling techniques centuries before European magical communities bothered to try anything beyond kill it with spells. You climb the mountain path where the Romanian longhorn has nested, passing scorched earth and scattered sheep bones, evidence of an apex predator that treats the village below as a convenient buffet. The dragon watches you approach with eyes that hold unsettling intelligence. And you remember reading that dragons can live for centuries, meaning this particular creature might remember when this valley was pure wilderness before humans built their presumptuous villages. Historically, dragon populations face severe pressure, not from Muggle knights, who rarely succeeded in actually killing dragons, but from wizards harvesting their blood, hide, heartstrings, and various organs for potion ingredients and wand cores, turning dragons into extremely dangerous natural resources. The establishment of dragon reserves in Romania, Sweden, Wales, and other locations came about partly from conservation concerns, but mostly from the realization that dragons kept setting Muggle buildings on fire, and the memory charm department couldn't keep up. You watch as the dragon handler, a witch named Magda with impressively thick protective gloves, approaches the longhorn with a fresh cow carcass, essentially paying protection money in meat form to prevent the dragon from raiding the village. The dragon accepts this tribute with regal indifference, and you notice that its golden eyes track every movement Magda makes, calculating threat levels and escape routes with the precision of a creature that has survived for 200 years by being smarter than everything trying to kill it. The medieval period saw the most intensive dragon-slaying efforts, with the real-world legend of St. George slaying the dragon around 280 CE, potentially representing actual wizard-dragon conflicts that entered Muggle mythology in distorted form, though proving this requires speculation that makes serious historians uncomfortable. You hear the cry before you see the bird, a low, throbbing wail that sounds like the world's saddest oboe being played in a bathroom for maximum echo effect, and you know immediately that an augury is near, predicting rain with the enthusiastic pessimism of someone who's made melancholy their entire personality. The augury, also called the Irish phoenix, bears that optimistic nickname despite looking nothing like a phoenix and possessing none of a phoenix's hopeful regenerative qualities, instead specializing in looking like a small, underfed vulture and crying about upcoming weather patterns. You spot the bird perched in a skeletal tree, its greenish-black plumage slicked with mist, and it observes you with eyes that seem to say, "I knew you'd come, and I'm not happy about it," which is presumably the look all auguries perfect shortly after hatching. For centuries, wizards believed that the augury's cry foretold death rather than simply rain, which led to an entirely understandable prejudice against a bird whose only crime was being a very accurate meteorologist with poor public relations. The confusion arose because auguries only sing when rain approaches, and in Britain's legendarily wet climate, that meant they sang constantly, creating the impression that death was always imminent, which technically isn't wrong but isn't the bird's fault either. Historical records from the 17th century describe wizarding families driving auguries away from their homes with loud noises and offensive spells, treating weather forecasters like harbingers of doom, and you can't help but feel this represents a fundamental misunderstanding of both ornithology and basic logic. The real-world case of the dodo's extinction in 1662 occurred partly because humans failed to recognize warning signs until too late, a pattern that nearly repeated with auguries when their population crashed due to systematic persecution by terrified wizards. You watch as this particular augury tilts its head and releases another mournful cry, and right on cue, rain begins pattering through the leaves, because apparently even this bird's weather predictions carry an air of vindicated sadness. The species came dangerously close to extinction until a wizard named Gulliver Pokaby proved in the 1730s that the cries predicted rain rather than death, publishing his findings in a pamphlet titled "Why I Didn't Die When the Augury Cried," which won no awards for poetic titles but did effectively save an entire species through aggressive fact-checking. Scholars continue to debate whether any actual predictive death-warning birds exist in the magical ecosystem or whether all such legends stem from misunderstood auguries, a discussion that becomes circular when participants can't agree on what constitutes evidence versus superstition. The bird before you performs another cry, this one apparently predicting the storm that's rolling in from the west, dark clouds gathering with the kind of dramatic timing that suggests weather itself enjoys proving auguries right. You've brought birdseed, though you're not entirely sure what auguries eat, and the bird regards your offering with deep suspicion, as though expecting the seeds to somehow validate its worldview that everything is terrible. Auguries are surprisingly difficult to care for in captivity, not because of complex dietary needs, but because their constant melancholy crying drives their keepers to the brink of depression, creating a sort of emotional feedback loop of sadness. The bird pecks tentatively at your offering, and you notice that up close, its feathers have an iridescent quality that's actually quite beautiful, though this beauty is somewhat undermined by another low wail that sounds like a foghorn being strangled. During the Victorian era, which saw the founding of the Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Animals in Britain in 1824, similar movements emerged in the wizarding world, though convincing people to protect a bird that literally sounds like an omen of doom required considerable public education efforts. You realize that the auguries near extinction represent something deeper than simple misunderstanding, reflecting humanity's tendency to destroy things that make us uncomfortable, rather than investigating whether our discomfort is actually justified. The bird finishes eating and immediately begins another mournful song, and you pat it gently on its damp head, thinking that perhaps we all need to be a bit more accepting of pessimists who turn out to be right about the weather, if nothing else. You step through a magical gateway into the Chamber of Secrets, descending through darkness, while serpent statues leer from the walls, and somewhere in the flooded depths below, you know the greatest and most terrible serpent in magical history waits in its centuries-old prison, the basilisk that nearly destroyed Hogwarts multiple times because apparently nobody thought to check whether the school's founder left any murder snakes in the plumbing. But before you face that particular monster, you pause in your journey to consider something more contemporary, because this story has traveled far from its origins and reached people across the entire world, carrying these tales of magical extinction and conservation to corners, where owls don't typically deliver mail. I'm really curious, from which part of the world are you watching this video? Write your country in the comments. Let's see how far this little story has traveled. The question matters more than simple curiosity because the wizarding world's approach to magical creatures varies enormously by culture and geography, with some societies treating them as sacred beings while others view them primarily as resources. And understanding these different perspectives helps explain why conservation efforts have succeeded in some regions while failing spectacularly in others. The Chinese fireball dragon commands reverence in Asia, while the common Welsh green faces constant prejudice in Britain, suggesting that magical creature protection often reflects deeper cultural values about nature and power. You might be reading this from a country where magical creatures exist in rich folklore traditions, or perhaps from somewhere their absence from local legend makes the Harry Potter universe feel particularly exotic. But either way, the themes of extinction and preservation transcend geographical boundaries. The Real-World Convention on International Trade in Endangered Species, established in 1973, came centuries after wizards established similar protections for magical creatures, proving that sometimes the magical community actually learned important lessons before Muggles did, though they'll never receive credit because of that pesky statute of secrecy. Scholars debate whether magical creatures exist in different densities worldwide, or whether some regions simply developed better concealment methods, with South American wizards apparently achieving remarkable success at keeping creatures like Akami populations hidden despite their size-changing abilities, making them particularly difficult to contain. You've paused on a landing halfway down to the chamber, surrounded by snake carvings that somehow manage to look judgmental, and you imagine all the people across different time zones encountering this story, some during morning commutes, others before sleep, creating a strange temporal community bound by interest in magical conservation. The internet has transformed how magical knowledge, or at least fictional magical knowledge, spreads across the world, reaching populations faster than any outpost could manage. Which raises interesting questions about how the actual wizarding world might struggle to control information in the modern era. Different countries bring different perspectives to these stories based on their own experiences with extinction and conservation, with some nations having lost species within living memory, while others still possess relatively intact ecosystems. And these real-world contexts color how we engage with tales of vanishing magical creatures. You remember reading about the extinction of the Tasmanian tiger in 1936, the last one dying in a zoo because someone forgot to let it into its sleeping quarters during cold weather, a death so preventable and stupid that it makes the magical world's conservation failure seem almost competent by comparison. The comment section will hopefully fill with countries from every continent, a small demonstration that stories about protecting endangered beings, magical or otherwise, carry universal appeal because extinction is a tragedy that transcends borders. You can almost hear the different languages in which people might be reading or listening to these words, the translations and interpretations shifting meanings in subtle ways because language shapes how we conceptualize conservation itself, with some cultures having words for ecological concepts that English lacks entirely. The global reach of Harry Potter as a phenomenon has created a weird situation where British magical lore now circulates in countries with their own rich magical traditions, creating a sort of cultural exchange program that nobody officially organized. Whether you're watching from a densely populated city where nature feels distant or from somewhere you can still hear actual wildlife outside your window, the core question remains the same. What responsibility do we bear toward creatures that share our world? What does it mean when we fail that responsibility? You descend the final steps into the Chamber of Secrets proper, your footsteps echoing in the massive underground cathedral of serpent worship, and you finally see it coiled in the shadows, the basilisk, the king of serpents, 50 feet of scaled death, whose gaze can kill instantly and whose very existence represents the pinnacle of magical creature hubris. The basilisk before you was bred, not born naturally, hatched from a chicken egg, incubated beneath a toad by Herpo the Fowl sometime in ancient Greece. Because apparently some wizards look at nature's magnificence and think, I can make that worse. The history of basilisk breeding is essentially a chronicle of wizards creating problems that future generations would regret. Like leaving a ticking time bomb in the basement, except the bomb is alive, can live for 900 years, and harbors understandable resentment about being locked in a sewer. You approach cautiously, eyes firmly shut because looking directly at a basilisk means instant death, which seems like poor evolutionary design until you realize its perfect defense mechanism, ensuring no predator gets a second chance to reconsider attacking. The specific basilisk in Hogwarts chamber was placed there by Salazar Slytherin around 990 CE, roughly the same time the Byzantine Empire was thriving and the Vikings were discovering North America, giving this particular monster a lifespan that spans most of recorded history. Scholars vigorously debate whether Slytherin actually intended the basilisk to purge Muggleborns from Hogwarts, or whether later followers misinterpreted his intentions, though frankly when someone leaves a giant murder snake in a school with instructions for their heir to unleash it, the room for misinterpretation seems limited. The real-world giant anaconda, which can reach 28 feet and is genuinely terrifying, still falls far short of basilisk dimensions, and imagine explaining to a Muggle herpetologist that wizards regularly bred snakes twice that size on purpose. You hear the massive creature shifting in the darkness, scales rasping against stone with sounds like knives being sharpened, and you're struck by the profound loneliness of being perhaps the last of your kind, even if your kind shouldn't exist in the first place. Basilisks require roosters' cries to be fatal to them, which represents such a specific weakness that it seems less like natural selection and more like someone implemented a debug mode, a kill switch built into an organism too dangerous to exist without one. The serpent before you has survived nearly 1,000 years by eating rats and whatever else wandered into the chamber, which raises disturbing questions about whether anything that falls into Hogwarts' plumbing system over the centuries eventually became snake food. A thought that makes you look at the murky water with new concern. Creating basilisks was made illegal in medieval times, probably after several incidents that the Ministry of Magic's historical records describe only as regrettable serpent situations, which is bureaucratic language for magical disasters. You speak parcel tongues, the language of snakes, and you can hear the basilisk's thoughts, bitter and ancient, remembering when Slytherin himself commanded it, when its purpose seemed clear rather than this endless waiting in darkness. The creature's mind is surprisingly intelligent, not the mindless killer you expected, but a being twisted by centuries of isolation and indoctrination, taught to hate Muggleborns by a founder whose prejudices infected even his pet. The Victorian era's fascination with natural history led some magical naturalists to argue for preserving even basilisks as part of magical biodiversity, a position that remains extremely unpopular for obvious reasons, though it does raise interesting questions about whether even dangerous beings deserve existence. You sense the basilisk's hunger, not just for food, but for freedom, for the forests it's never seen, for sky and sun that its creator denied it by design, and you understand that extinction might be mercy for a species that exists only to kill. The debate over whether to preserve the last basilisks in captivity or let the species die completely continues to divide the magical creature welfare community, with some arguing that letting them vanish would prevent future tragedies, while others insist that deliberately extinguishing any species crosses an ethical line. You stand in the forbidden forest near Hogwarts, waiting in the moonlight, and eventually you see them emerge from the shadows, the thestrals, skeletal winged horses whose black coats absorb light like living voids, visible only to those who have witnessed death and understood its finality. The thestral herd approaches silently, their leathery wings folded against bodies so thin you can count ribs, and their white pupilless eyes fix on you with the unsettling familiarity of creatures who see death in everyone they meet. These beings occupy a unique space in magical creature classification, neither common enough to be unremarkable nor rare enough to require intensive protection, existing in a conservation middle ground that often means they're overlooked in favor of flashier species. You've qualified to see thestrals ever since your grandmother died when you were 12, the moment their forms solidified from invisible to unavoidable, a strange gift that comes with grief, and you remember the shock of spotting the Hogwarts carriages apparently pulling themselves before you learned the truth. The thestral you approach now is particularly ancient, its hide scarred from decades of service to Hogwarts, and it nuzzles your hand with surprising gentleness, despite looking like something death itself would ride. Historical records of thestrals are complicated by the fact that only some wizards could see them to record them, leading to centuries of confusion about phantom horses that some people swore existed, while others saw nothing, which must have made for awkward academic conferences. The real-world association between horses and death appears across many cultures, from the pale horse of the biblical apocalypse to various psychopomp legends, suggesting that thestrals might represent a magical manifestation of deeply rooted human symbolism. Scholars continue to debate whether thestrals are truly invisible to those who haven't witnessed death, or whether they exist in a state of quantum uncertainty, simultaneously present and absent until observed by a qualified viewer, which sounds like physics, but is actually just magical biology being deliberately confusing. The herd before you numbers about 30, a stable population maintained by Hogwarts' Care of Magical Creatures program. And you watch as a younger thestral learns to fly, launching itself awkwardly into the air with wing strokes that gradually smooth into eerie grace. Thestrals gained unfortunate reputations as omens of doom, which frankly seems unfair considering they're just trying to exist while being invisible to most people, which is arguably harder than whatever misfortune superstitious wizards want to blame on them. During the medieval period, around the time of the Black Death in the 1340s, thestral sightings supposedly increased dramatically as more people qualified to see them, creating populations that could suddenly perceive a species that had always been there, which must have felt like the universe adding a disturbing bonus feature to grief. You offer the thestral raw meat, which it accepts with the delicate manners of a creature that knows it makes people uncomfortable and tries to compensate by being excessively polite about its carnivorous diet. The breeding habits of thestrals remain somewhat mysterious because studying creatures that most researchers can't see presents obvious methodological challenges, leading to significant gaps in magical zoology's understanding of their reproduction and social structure. You stroke the thestral's neck, feeling bones too prominent beneath the hide, and it makes a sound somewhere between a horse's nicker and wind through a graveyard, which seems appropriate for an animal whose entire aesthetic is death's favorite pet. The protected status of thestrals is relatively secure, partly because they're useful for transportation and partly because the Ministry of Magic maintains breeding populations for official use, creating a situation where their conservation stems from utility rather than inherent value, which feels slightly cynical but probably accurate. Watching the herd interact, you notice complex social behaviors, hierarchies, and relationships that exist completely hidden from the majority of the magical world, an entire ecosystem of experience happening in plain sight to those who cannot see. The youngest thestrals, foals, whose spindly legs make them look even more fragile than the adults, play together in ways that seem shockingly normal until you remember they're invisible death horses, which rather undermines the wholesomeness of watching baby animals frolic. You walk slowly through the forest one final time as dawn approaches, watching the magical creatures begin to fade, not into extinction, but into the gentler disappearance of a story reaching its natural end, and you understand now that every tale of conservation is really about the moment we choose to pay attention before it's too late. The creatures you've encountered tonight, from the golden snidget's desperate flight to the thestral's patient vigil, all represent different facets of the same question. What do we owe to the beings we share the world with, and what does it mean when we fail them? You pause beside a stream where a kelpie once lived, the water spirit long since relocated to a protected sanctuary, and you trail your fingers through water that remembers hoofbeats and magic, even if the creature itself has moved on. The sky is lightening, soft purple giving way to rose gold, and somewhere an augury calls once more, predicting not death, but simply the rain that will come this afternoon, its cry no longer frightening, but oddly comforting in its certainty. The forest seems less dense now, the paths clearer, and you realize that your journey through magical creature conservation has taught you that extinction is never just about biology, but about stories, about the narratives we tell ourselves about which lives matter and which can be sacrificed for convenience or profit or simple indifference. A hippogriff crosses your path, golden in the early light, and it bows slightly in that peculiar way they have, waiting for you to return the gesture, which you do with appropriate respect because some courtesies transcend species. The real triumph of magical creature conservation isn't the dramatic rescues or the breeding programs, but the quiet daily work of people who care when it would be easier not to, who maintain sanctuaries and update records and argue in ministry meetings for funding that never seems quite adequate. You think about all the creatures you've encountered, the dangerous and the gentle, the misunderstood and the genuinely threatening, and you understand that conservation requires holding multiple truths simultaneously, that something can be beautiful and dangerous, that preservation matters even when it's difficult, that some species perhaps should fade, but the decision to let them go must be made carefully, ethically, with full understanding of what will be lost. The basilisk in its chamber, the thestrals in their herd, the snidgets in their sanctuary all exist in this complicated space between wild and managed, free and protected, and you suspect this reflects something true about all endangered species, magical or otherwise, that in the modern world survival often requires compromising independence for safety. The forest grows quieter still as you walk, creatures settling into their dens and nests, nocturnal beings yielding to those who prefer daylight, the eternal rotation continuing as it has for thousands of years before wizards arrived to complicate everything. Your eyelids grow heavy, the night's journey catching up to you, and the path ahead seems to soften at the edges, becoming less distinct, more dreamlike. A phoenix calls somewhere distant, its song like crystallized hope, and you wonder if it's one of the wild ones or an escaped pet. Whether distinction even matters when the sound itself carries such impossible beauty. The trees lean closer, their branches forming a canopy that filters the growing light into gentle green patterns on the forest floor, and you find yourself slowing, your steps becoming smaller, softer, less urgent. You pass a clearing where unicorns supposedly graze, though you see only silver shadows that might be mist or might be magic, and you're too tired now to care which. The magical world is fading not into darkness, but into the warm gold of early morning, into the space between waking and dreaming, where stories live most vividly, where extinct creatures can exist again in memory and imagination. Your journey ends where it began, at the forest's edge, civilization visible through the trees, modern and mundane and utterly necessary. You turn for one last look at the depths behind you, at the shadows that hold history and heartbreak and hope, at the invisible threads connecting endangered species across continents and centuries. The last thing you hear is the forest breathing, the collective sound of 1,000 hidden creatures settling into sleep, and you close your eyes and join them.